So we're here at Cornell, obviously, which has often been talked about as there's often this idea that there is a Cornell to Wall Street pipeline, which I do believe exists. So I want to juxtapose that a little bit by actually talking about the school to prison pipeline, because not everyone is being funneled into the academic world and then on to the corporate world. A lot of people are being funneled directly into jail cells and cages. So I want to talk a little bit about this with the panelists, with a focus on widening our analyses of what the prison industrial complex actually is, what that entails, and also widening an analysis of mass incarceration. It's a little bit different. And maybe also talking about alternative systems of accountability and how we can disrupt mass criminalization. Who wants to start?
Yeah, I feel like my thoughts are kind of all over the place with this, but so we have like the police and prisons and the courts, obviously, like that constitute the prison industrial complex as we understand it. But when I think about this, a lot of times, like I also think beyond that in terms of like homeless shelters and public housing and basically like institutions that are created for like poor people, predominantly like Black people and Latinos that put us under like increased surveillance and put us in increased contact with the police that make us more like vulnerable to seeing like the military or like really like life-threatening ways of supporting yourself as like the only ways to survive. In terms of ways to combat that, that's like a huge question. I'm like definitely still trying to figure that out. But I think it's really important that we create spaces to like come together and discuss what the impacts of those systems look like, and also to have spaces to discuss that that are not, you know, like seeking dialogue with like policymakers or like different like stakeholders and this sort of like nonprofit language for like putting people who are like on the receiving end of like state violence in contact with those perpetrators of violence. Yeah.
So this is something that Kristen and I have been talking about through other times, moments of conversation about what does safety and protection mean, right? When we're so much, you know, in constant forms of, you know, violence, you know, it's sometimes very hard to think about, well, how do we think about what does safety really mean without, you know, state interference such as the police, right? So how do we think about what does safety mean for us and for each other, and how do we start doing those forms of holding each other accountable, right? So thinking about really asking ourselves to explore that more collectively within the work that we're doing. I was sharing, Kristen was talking, she could share more about the networks of survival of domestic violence and whatnot, about how people really are trying to do that work. That is it's a process. It's not that's I think what we're trying to think about here, right? You know, about what does that look like, and constant practicing about asking ourselves those questions. What does safety mean without, you know, having, you know, police come and interfere? And because in actuality they reproduce more violence, as we're seeing more and more, such as, you know, with example Ferguson right now. And then want to say a few things, I guess, about what was used to build up the prison industrial complex in the first place, and this idea of safety that's like intensely racial and intensely racist. So Dylan Rodriguez, prison abolitionist, has spoken some about how the whole idea of safety just needs to be radically worked because it's intensely and outrageously used to basically give police and the state complete license to commit genocide, to commit mass incarceration against Black, Indigenous, communities of color, for profit, right, and continued land occupation. And a huge part of the story, right, about how like prisons were built up, besides being technologies taken from the period of enslavement, in the 1960s, more recent, during the revolts of Black, Native, and Third World peoples in and outside U.S. empire, Rodriguez traced the whole law and order agenda that was pushed by Nixon, Reagan, others. They built this up elaborately over time, which would allow them to try to contain, control, dissolve, and dispel these movements, which, right, COINTELPRO was an FBI program that was set up in this country to neutralize revolts of communities of color from here and around the world. So this scare tactic was used to basically incite racist violence from white genocidal populace, right, to co-sign on the prison industrial complex being built up. And so there was a lot going on in the background of that, but part of what happened, a major criticism of the anti-violence efforts that were happening around that time, is that the state successfully was able to infiltrate and take desire to end violence in all its forms by playing on white women's racism, and then was able to build up this prison industrial complex. And there's a lot of intersecting stories about this, but that's an important history, and that's something we need to be thinking about today, because we live in a mass incarceration and mass criminalization, and talking about creating confrontational spaces in daily lives, but also just in these other larger moments of how we're going to disrupt this.